Welcome to Value Education, Perspectives on Process. This is a series of conversations with educators, administrators, teachers, and students that will provide insight into the thinking and the activities that go on in the Rhinebeck School District. My name is Valerie Feit, and I'm co-director of school counseling, and I'm also the K-12 enrichment coordinator. I'm joined here today with my co-host, Dylan Spencer in grade 11, and our guest, Lucas Pasquina, grade 12. So welcome to both of you. We have a conversation today about your project in the Independent Learner Program, which allows you to do a self-directed project over time. So Lucas, what did you do?
Well, my project for the Independent Learner Program is to create a podcast. So I have a podcast titled Finding Faith, and in it, my goal is to answer the question, how is youth involvement in organized religion changing? And it consists of interviews with faith leaders and religious youth from the community, as well as research and reflections that I make based off of what I hear in the interviews.
That's very unusual. How did you come to that?
Well, it's actually been a very long path to get there. I was raised Catholic. I was baptized when I was really young, and I spent my whole childhood going to Sunday school. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, when I was around 8th grade, I really started to question my relationship to religion, specifically the Catholic Church. And I really went on a path to find out what my relationship with the Catholic Church was. And then with Rhinebeck, I was able to participate in the TEDx program and give my own TEDx talk. And that's what led me to really further explore my own relationship to the Catholic Church.
I remember the TEDx event. It was TEDx Rhinebeck High. And your talk was called?
The title of my talk was What I'd Say to the Pope. And my opening line was, "Hi, I'm Lucas Pasquina, and I used to be a Catholic." And it was supposed to be about my relationship with the church and how I felt that the way I was educated about faith was very outdated, and I feel like it didn't relate to me at the time. And it was because of that lack of ability to relate to the Catholic Church that I really turned away and was forced to look into other alternatives to faith.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to the Pope?
Well, it's not super simple, but the main takeaway from my my TED Talk, was that what we learned in our religious education process was not modern enough for how we live today. We learned that stay off the internet and that be careful what you post, and while that's relevant, I feel like the way that we were taught things was not a way that correlated to the 21st century. And I really felt alienated by the way we were taught to learn about faith, and we really lacked the ability to build a community and build a connection to the church. Instead, we learned different Bible stories and the meaning behind the 10 Commandments, but when you don't have faith to begin with, it's hard for you to relate and actually care about the things that we were learning. So what I'd say to the Pope was to try to focus on building a relationship to God, then moving on to learning different concepts about the church.
And I think what I remember at the time was that you also had some really cool suggestions about using cell phones to communicate.
Yeah. Other than just going to masses on Sundays, I thought ways you could incorporate faith practices into a daily life, such as, I know they have apps for it now, but at the time, having daily Bible verses that you would read, or online communities where you talk about faith, and creating a community like that is something that could really incorporate religion into a daily life through technology in a way that we can all relate to.
So after that, you moved away after the TED Talk was over. What did you explore next?
Well, after having such a reflection on my own experience, I wanted to learn more about the religion I had talked about. So with Anna Boswell, who's also a grade 12 student at Rhinebeck, we conducted a Bible study. Well, it ended up evolving into a greater study, but it started with studying the Gospel according to Matthew. And we read the whole Gospel and created very, very detailed notes about how everything we read related to our daily lives and the great takeaways that we had. And by reading about the Jesus's story and about the Gospels, we were able to create ties to other faith practices or other spiritual practices. So simultaneously, we studied other texts, like we studied a lot of Sumerian mythology, but also the tarot and astrology and other things that are almost like condemned by the Catholic Church. But surprisingly, we were able to find a lot of ties between what's said in the gospel and what's said in all these different other faith practices and spiritual traditions, which was something that was really interesting.
So typically we don't, religion is not at school.
Yeah.
It's something completely outside of school. So how did you manage to, obviously this means a lot to you, how did you manage to tie your personal feelings about faith and wanting to make an exploration into it with a school project?
Well, I think because of the structure of the independent learner program, I was able to pursue something on my own, and I think that's where I was able to do something that was more related to religion, because it wasn't like I was being forced to learn or I was trying to impose beliefs I had elsewhere. It was really self-led. And while I had assistance, most of the research was about faith, and it was independent research. But additionally, I studied the traditions, but I also studied the way that people related to these traditions. So that included going to different faith services in my community, and it ended up evolving into Finding Faith, where I interviewed faith leaders. But at that point in time, it really came from studying the way that religion is written, but also the way people relate to religion and the way people create connections to faith.
So it was really social science.
Yeah.
So did you have a research question?
My research question was, how do people relate to religious symbolism? And the research question really evolved later with Finding Faith and creating the podcast. But at that point in time, it was more studying the way that religious symbols are able to connect people and the way that a religious symbol could be universal throughout different faiths, with whether or not people know about the symbol, that many of them have like the same definitions, and like different symbols can mean the same things in different faiths. And I think the way that so many religions have core beliefs that are shared is a way that's able to connect people rather than divide them. So that's really something that I wanted to study with the Bible study, and then like looking into other faiths, but then also that's what led me towards Finding Faith as a project.
So there's numerous ways in which one can express their findings, and what you studied is easily presentable via many forms of media, be it text, on blogs, or any writing format. But I'm curious as to why you chose the podcast format as opposed to any other alternative.
I felt like the podcast was the best way to capture really how people feel about faith and people's relationship to faith. I think hearing someone talk about their own faith tradition is a way to understand their passion. And someone can write an article about the gospel, or someone can write an article about the tarot. But I think once you hear someone talk about their own faith and talk about what led them to faith, you really get a much more personal view and a much more accurate view of the way someone feels about a religion. And also with Finding Faith as a podcast, you seem a lot more professional than just a blog post. Like as a student, a trouble that I felt like I was going to run into was that because I'm so young, people might not take me seriously. So by being able to send them a sizzle reel is what we call it, or like a 1.5-minute chunk of of a trailer for your podcast, people are able to look at that clearly and say, this kid's serious, like he's actually doing something. So I was able to create a very finite and tangible product for everything I was learning. So I really think the podcast was the best way to go about that.
Right.
Did you evolve your research question? I mean, how did that flow from the symbolism into, the podcast, obviously the head content. So what was the research question at that point?
At that point, I will admit, I don't think we had much of a research question. We wanted to study how symbolism from different religions
in
related.
the podcast.
Oh,
I'm
the podcast, sorry.
Okay.
In the podcast at the beginning, I wanted to focus on how youth relate to organized religion today, but I think it ended up evolving into the way organized religion is changing, because a lot of what I studied in the beginning was faith leaders who have already reached ordination or who have already dedicated their lives to faith. And I wanted to study what led them to that life and then how that differs from today. So the experience of how a minister growing up in the 1970s, the way that they related to faith is very different than the way that youth can relate to faith today. So by studying both youth from today and faith leaders from the past, you're able to create that bridge. And I think that's where I came up with the research question of how is youth involvement in organized religion changing, or how is it evolving even? And that's where that tie came from.
You mentioned you spoke to leaders, to religious leaders. Who specifically?
Well, my first episode was I interviewed Pastor Karen Berger from the Mamaroneck United Methodist Church. She was my first interview, and she's someone I know very well, actually. And by talking to her, a main takeaway that I had was that youth have not lost the ability to be spiritual, but rather we've lost the time to. I think that's a very big distinction to have, is a lot of people have the idea that because we have cell phones now, because we have the internet and science and all these new things, people are unable to connect to the religion and connect to different faith practices. But I think that's not true, and that's a real thing I discussed with Pastor Karen, is that because when she grew up, Sunday was a day of rest, and nothing was scheduled for Sunday. Sunday was when you were supposed to go to church, you were supposed to relax, be with your family. But now people have soccer games on Sundays. I know I have track meets on Sundays. And Sunday is a time to prepare for Monday. So we really don't have that time dedicated to being spiritual and dedicated to expanding our faith practices. And that's really the change that caused the decline in church membership. And that's really what we discussed with Pastor Karen.
But you had a wide variety of guests.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about some of the other people that you spoke with. I know not only Christian faith, but...
The next interview I had was with a rabbi named Rabbi Howard Goldsmith from the Congregation of Emmanuel of Westchester. The interview I had with him was really surprising, actually. I learned a lot about the Jewish faith and then how that relates to my research question. The big takeaway I had from that interview was that Judaism, unlike Christianity, is a religion but also a culture. A lot of what Rabbi Goldsmith told me about his roots was that he struggled with faith as a teenager, and he wasn't always so sure in his religious faith. But because he had that Jewish cultural background, he always felt like a Jew. And then that was a thing that Christianity lacks, is that if you don't believe in God, then you no longer become a Christian. But if you don't believe in the spiritual sides of Judaism, you can still identify as a Jewish person. So having that Jewish culture to fall back on is something that can keep your faith practice and your spirituality alive going through your life in a way that it can in Christianity. And I think that gave me that really changed my perspective of faith, because now I really think about how can we make Christianity or other faith practices also cultural in a way that we feel a tie or an affinity from birth to the faith practice that we have, and then how that can relate to creating a faith environment that nurtures faith rather than turns away once you show any inkling of doubt.
Now, I know one of the other, you've got a couple, I know you interviewed a student at Yale Divinity School, and also you went to the Himalayas.
Oh, yeah.
What about that? You went to the Himalayas. That's pretty crazy,
yeah.
right?
Well, I could first start with the Yale Divinity School student and then move on to what happened. But so at first, I contacted a professor of ministerial studies, so the studies of how to be a minister and how to share the Word of God. And talking to him, he talked about the Youth Ministry Institute, which is an organization started at Yale and founded by this Yale professor in the 1950s to study how youth relate to religion. And the big thing that I learned from him is that we are able to, that a lot of youth ministers now are not trained, and a lot of them don't go to divinity school, so they don't know properly the way to teach the Word of God. And a lot of them are just very passionate people that care a lot, but sharing that belief is different than having a strong sense of it. So I think a lot of what we talked about was how the Youth Ministry Institute and Yale Divinity School is able to teach the ministers of tomorrow, which then can train the youth of tomorrow into becoming youth. And it was really more about how do we perpetuate the system of, or how do we continue the system of learning and teaching that we have in place today, and how can we make it better, and how can we make it evolve?
So just real quick, what about the Himalayas?
Oh, okay. So I think, as everyone knows, the Himalayas is like a hotbed for different religious diversity. And so I had a connection with the religious head of Sikkim. Her name is Hope Namgyal, and I was able to live with her in the Himalayas and then go to a Buddhist-affiliated boarding school called Manjusri Public School. And by going there, I was able to talk to Tibetan Buddhists that practice like this very specific form of Buddhism and speak this very specific language. And what I really learned from them was sort of similar to Rabbi Goldsmith, and how their religion is so ingrained in their culture and their society that it really sticks with them. Even if they believe in religion or not, it sticks with them as a cultural practice. But a danger that came from being in a place like the Himalayas that was so remote and separated, as they get more and more influence from the rest of the world, they tend to leave their beliefs for other ones that are more popular. So I know like South Korean pop music was like, in South Korean culture, was very big in the place I was in the Himalayas. So a lot of their Bhutia traditions, which was the name of the tribe that like dominated the area, were falling and diminishing, and people weren't wearing the traditional dress anymore. They don't speak the traditional language because everyone there either spoke English or Nepali. So it was interesting to learn about how a tradition is maintained when it's in such a minority or such a small like niche group. So that really, again, changed my perspective, because coming from like Catholic roots, like being like when there are Catholics all over the world, there are not Tibetan Buddhists all over the world. So it was a very different way of viewing religion than the way I view it like in my society today.
So you mentioned the religiously dominant societies. Here in Westchester, religious influence, especially compared to the more extremist areas, is a lot less prevalent. Do you think there is a primary reason as to why religion may infiltrate our culture less than, say, in the Himalayas?
I think that's a really hard question to answer.
Good question.
But I would say that we're a very liberal society in a way that like we're very progressive, and I think that in a way people have very strong stigmas around religion, and I'm not saying that they're not they don't have truth behind them, but I think a lot of associations with the Catholic Church and faith is an oppressive force rather than a force that's able to unite. I think having that mentality really makes people turn away from a religion, or even if you are religious, you feel uncomfortable talking about it. I know that around some of my like friends who are not religious, I feel almost uncomfortable to really go into why I practice or why I feel the way I do, because of fear of being associated with like more negative sides of the church. There's a lot of like, there are a lot of problems, and like I know that like that is true, like in faith traditions and in different faith communities, there are problems that need to be addressed. And I think when people focus on those problems rather than focusing on the good, we are unable to like see that good side. And I think that's a thing that is prevalent in our community today, is that by trying to be more progressive and trying to make sure that no one is offended, which makes sense, like I am all for being progressive, I think that we almost turn away from the good sides of religion.
Okay.
Right.
I just sort of to build on that, but really because we really only have a few more minutes. What is your takeaway? So you've analyzed a lot of things. How has this informed your life?
I think that this has really influenced my life and just the way I view like the daily struggle of the way we go through our daily lives. One thing that I've really taken away from my study with religion is the belief that everything happens for a reason. I think when we get bogged down with daily struggles, like I know I'm applying to colleges and I'm taking like all these really hard classes, that you almost forget like what you're working for, and the daily struggle of going through the motions just really can really depress me sometimes. But when you take a step back and think about like this is all part of a plan, or whether or not you believe in destiny, this is leading to something else. And I think having the belief that this happened for a reason, or we're here for a reason, really is able to open your mind to like different ways of viewing the world. And it really helps you move on from struggles and move through pain to like something greater. Okay,
well, this was fascinating. I know that you're applying for college. I wish you the very best in that process. Whoever gets you is very lucky.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. It's wonderful to do the show with you. And we just want to say thank you to our audience for watching. This has been Value Education, Perspectives on Process. And we look forward to having you with us when we have many more guests and much more to say.